Good evening, class. I hope that everyone is healthy and well. For the remainder of the semester, the religions that we're going to be covering are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This particular lecture today will deal with an introduction to the Abrahamic religions in general, uh, an introduction to Judaism, and we'll focus on some of the contents of the book of Genesis after saying a bit about the Hebrew Bible. The Abrahamic religions, which is what the religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are called that because they share a common ancestry, according to tradition, in the person of Abraham. Um, they also have shared metaphysical commitments and narrative history, and this makes them different from other religions that you've already studied. The religions of the world can be divided into many different groups. They can be divided into country of origin, but they can also be divided into those which share underlying metaphysical structures. So, for example, if we take religions such as Confucianism and Taoism, who have their origin in China, we can also see that they have certain shared metaphysical structures, like the belief in Qi or the belief in the Tao. If we go to the Dharmic religions who have their origin in India, for example, again, they share certain metaphysical commitments, such as the belief in karma. Um, and with the Abrahamic religions, we have similar structures shared by all, such as the belief in one God, the belief in prophecy, and the belief that this one God is interested in individuals and provides morality and guidance. I also want to say a bit before we get into the particularities of any one of these three Abrahamic religions. Uh, the most world religion books structure these religions by giving them each a chapter and separating them out. It usually begins with Judaism, then Christianity, and then Islam. And this is how we'll proceed as well with the lectures. But I think it's worth sorry, it's worth exploring the interconnectivity of these three religions and the metaphysical commitments they share, as well as the narrative structures and stories that they share. So, what I mean by that is Judaism, which draws much of its inspirational source and understanding of God from the Hebrew Bible. This Hebrew Bible will also be referred to in the New Testament. So, for example, in the New Testament, the same characters in the Hebrew Bible will be mentioned in the New Testament. And in a similar way, the Quran will mention both characters in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament as well. So, a good example would be Abraham, for example. Abraham is first mentioned in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Genesis, I believe it's chapter 12. He'll be mentioned again in the New Testament. He'll be referred to in the Gospels, as well as some of the epistle writers will mention Abraham, and then he will also be referred to in the Quran. So these three religions have particular sacred scriptures, and these three sacred scriptures, the Hebrew Bible in Judaism, the Hebrew Bible and New Testament uh, in Christianity, and the Quran is in Islam, will be referring to many of the same people. And so this is helpful to keep in mind. We'll begin with Judaism, and we will also begin with exploring contents in the Hebrew Bible, and then we will sort of see them added to, interpreted differently, reinterpreted by Christianity, and then again in Islam. So this is one thing to keep in mind. The shared metaphysical commitments, particularly of monotheism, of revelation through prophecy, of this devotion to one God, shared by all three of the religions. And oftentimes, when there is differences in theology, they will still be referring to quite similar events in the scriptures. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the Hebrew Bible. Your book provides a timeline, and the first event on it says timeline of Judaism. This will be on page the first chapter, 178 in the World Religions textbook. It'll provide a timeline for Judaism. And the first event on that timeline, we're talking about BCE, before the Common Era, is it says traditional date for the birth of Abraham. The date given is 1812 BCE. And so I think it might be helpful to sort of fill in some of the narrative gaps leading up to Abraham. And so, after discussing a bit of the structure of Genesis and some of the notable events in Genesis, I'll go ahead and do that. I'll fill in the narrative gaps up to Abraham, and then which will get us to Genesis 12. There's 50 chapters in Genesis, and then I will briefly outline from Abraham to Joseph when the Israelites begin to live in Egypt, and this will be essentially the end of Genesis. And then in a further lecture, I'll begin with the contents of Exodus. One of the challenging things about teaching world religions and each particular religion is the massive amount of sacred texts related to the tradition. Um, just in Genesis in particular, trying to decide, well, what to say, how to say it, how to summarize it, is quite challenging. Ideally, it would be great as we went into each world religion if you had read the entire Hebrew Bible, say for Judaism, and the entire New Testament for Christianity, and the entire Quran for Islam. This would be ideal. If you have, that's great. If you haven't, just sort of be aware of the challenges. I'll be trying to summarize many of what I find are the important narrative events, but as you may know, I will unfortunately leave much out. That's not to say it's not important. Hopefully, it may motivate you to read more. It's quite fascinating text. So, for the Hebrew Bible in general is divided into three parts. The first part is the Pentateuch, the often described as the Law or the first five books traditionally ascribed to Moses. These five books are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And according to tradition, this was given to Moses on Mount Sinai as a revelation of the divine, in which he later recorded. These are the first five books of the uh, the Hebrew Bible. The next section of the Hebrew Bible is known as the prophets, and these prophets are broken into the former prophets and the latter prophets. And they're each have four books. The former prophets, it begins with the book of Joshua, then the book of Judges, then the book of Samuel, and then the book of Kings. The latter prophets are Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and the book of the 12 minor prophets. And then the latter portion of the Hebrew Bible is known as the writings. This has a variety of different literatures. This is where you get the wisdom literature. You get books such as Job, you get the Psalms, you get the Proverbs, you get Ecclesiastes, you get a variety of literature, and this structure of the Hebrew Bible is, if we jump for a moment to another religion, Christianity, in which the Hebrew Bible is understood as the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible has a different structure than the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible is structured the law, then the prophets, and then the writings. Whereas the Old Testament is essentially structured the law, the writings, and then the prophets pointing to the New Testament and the arrival of Jesus Christ. Whereas in the Hebrew Bible, it's pointing more as towards what we might call a conversation with the three texts. Right? And so it's a different structure. same contents, but just structured in a different. So, as mentioned, the first five books of the Hebrew Bible are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we're going to focus for the remainder of this lecture on the contents of the book of Genesis. So, Genesis is often divided into two parts, chapters 1 through 11, referred to as the mythic history of Genesis, and then chapters 12 through 50, which is also seen as the history, but more so of a history between various generations and their interactions with God. So the first generation of individuals who form covenants and interact with God would be Abraham and Sarah. Next will be Isaac and his wife Rebecca, and then um, their children um, will become Jacob, whose name becomes Israel, and his wives Rachel and Leah. So we have more of a story narrative in which God is interacting with particular people that he has made, or God has made covenants with. And then the former chapters 1 through 11 is focusing on what we might call mythic history or early creation stories. Chapter 1 of Genesis is focusing on the creation of all this is. This is when you get scriptures such as, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The focus on chapter 1 in Genesis in describing all that God creates is essentially twofold. One is that it shows that it's orderly and that the world is not just chaos, but what is being conveyed in the story is that there's an order to things and that this order is good. Um, then we have an elaboration on that creation story, sometimes referred to as a second creation story, in which we focus particularly on human beings. Right? This is when God creates the first people, places them in the garden, gives them the commandments not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We have the serpent explaining or tempting them to do this, and then we have the humans um, um, eating of the fruit and being cast out of the garden. A brief note. So, if again we will be talking the rest of the semester concerning the religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and so this might be the first point to sort of show how each tradition draws upon the narrative, but can interpret it somewhat differently theologically. So, for if we take Christianity, for example, when we look at this scene in Genesis of the garden, the uh, the first people eating of the tree of the knowledge and disobeying God, and therefore being cast out. Uh, Christianity will interpret this first transgression and the result of it as human beings after Adam and Eve, excuse me, have a fallen nature, one in which they are essentially can no longer be pleasing to God, but need to have some type of salvation from this fallen nature. And although Christianity does this, this is not shared with the theological beliefs of Judaism or Islam. They see the disobedience of the first humans, but they don't theologically see the result of that as from now on all human beings have a fallen nature because of it. So here we have an example of the three Abrahamic religions, each looking at a story, but drawing slightly different theological results. And so this is what I mean by a shared narrative structure that the three religions have. Okay, so after the first couple chapters of Genesis, we have the creation, we have the being cast out of the Garden of Eden, we have a variety of punishments associated with that. Then we have Adam and Eve having their first children, Cain and Abel, and those children both offering sacrifice to God. God being more pleased with the sacrifice of Abel than of Cain. And then we have the tragic story of the first murder, which is Cain killing Abel. Adam and Eve have more children, one of those being Seth, and that's sort of uh, where the generations go. Um, you sort of have a genealogy from these first individuals um, to more and more people populating the earth. After the story of Cain killing Abel, we have the story of the flood. This is Genesis chapter 6 through 9, in which God decides to flood the earth. Uh, and he, or not he, God um, makes a provision for Noah and his family, according to this story, to build an ark, and they are essentially saved from the flood. This is also one of the first covenants afterwards. God makes a covenant or promise to Noah never to flood the earth again. From the descendants of Noah, we are told Abraham um, is from the descendants of Noah. Um, and this will be in beginning in chapter 12 of Genesis. Prior to that, sort of between the story of Noah and the flood and the early stories of Abraham and Sarah interacting with God, we have the also notable story of the Tower of Babel in chapter 11 of Genesis. This is when it sort of described all the peoples of the earth sort of come together and build or try to build a tower to the heavens, but God confuses or confounds the languages, and they leave off building the tower to the heavens. Genesis 1 through 11 sort of concludes what we might call the mythic history of the Hebrew Bible. And then we begin to focus on particular people, even though we kind of focus on the particular person of Noah prior to that. The next series of chapters in Genesis 12 through 50 deal with particular peoples or generations interacting with God, God making promises to them, and then a variety of interactions happening between God and the various people that God is the God of. The first being Abraham and Sarah. So this begins the next section. We have a progression in Genesis of God making a covenant with Abraham and Sarah that God will make their descendants as numerous as the illustrations are the stars in the sky or the sands in the on the seashore. And this is particularly interesting because Abraham and Sarah have no children, and Sarah is 90 and Abraham is 100 years old. So when uh, Sarah does give birth to Isaac, uh, it is seen as a miraculous birth. Shortly thereafter, Abraham is essentially tested by God. This is a story, the notable story, sometimes referred to as the Passion of Abraham or the Passion of Isaac, in which um, in which Abraham is called to sacrifice Isaac, the son, and he is willing to do it, but right before he is about to sacrifice him, God sends an angel to stop him from doing that. This is later. This story is later referred to in the New Testament epistle writers, for example, as a model of a faithful person. Abraham is sort of seen as a paradigm of faith for trusting in God and obeying God. Um, so uh, the story of Genesis then follows Isaac, who marries Rebekah, and they have a son named Jacob. And then the storyline progresses, and Jacob um, has two wives, Rachel and Leah, and they end up having 12 um, sons. And Jacob, in another story, ends up wrestling with an angel, and he is given the new name of Israel, which translates into he who wrestles with God. And so Israel can refer to well, it refers to many things, and we'll uh, show all the different uh, um, concepts or people or or um, or designations Israel refers to in later lectures. But one thing it can refer to is Jacob. So Jacob and Israel uh, are essentially in certain contexts is the same person, right? Israel can also refer to as the 12 northern tribes of Israel, um, as opposed to Judah in the south being separate from the 12 tribes in the north, and Israel can refer to other things as well, which we'll get into. Right? So Jacob, the story now focuses Jacob and the 12 sons. The youngest son, whose name is Benjamin, he does not come until later in the story. But the second youngest son, his name is Joseph, and this is the uh, individual that the story of Genesis now focuses on. And we're sort of nearing the conclusion of Genesis here. So Joseph is favored by his father Jacob, and all of the other 10 brothers really dislike him because of this. And he has the ability both to dream dreams that seem prophetic and also interpret dreams. And he has this one dream which he shares with the other brothers, that he was essentially everyone was essentially bowing to him, and so this really irritates him. They take actions to get rid of him, which results in him being sold, uh, and eventually um, being put into Egypt, where he's sold and then taken to Egypt. He shortly after he is sold, he does find favor with the Pharaoh, and rises to a position of power. We'll get into that in a second. But the brothers, after selling Joseph, they lie and tell their father Jacob that he's dead. So this is seen as a sort of a tragedy in the story. While in Egypt, Pharaoh has this disturbing dream, and he cannot find anyone to interpret the dream. It is told by him that Joseph has this ability to interpret dreams, and so Joseph is called and does interpret this dream of Pharaoh's, and is rewarded for it. The dream. The interpretation of the dream is essentially that Egypt will experience 7 years of prosperity, and then afterwards experience 7 years of famine. Once this dream is interpreted, they take action and they store up much food in the 7 years of plenty to survive the famine. Now, the famine isn't restricted particularly to the land of Egypt, but rather is sort of in the neighboring lands as well. And so this causes Jacob's sons, the 10 sons, and now Benjamin is also born, to go to Egypt to get food, and there they are reunited with Joseph. And it's a complex and dramatic story, but again, this is just a summary, so we can't go into all the details. But toward the end, there is reconciliation between Joseph and the brothers. There's one interesting thing when we get into um, sort of paradigms in viewing um, the way God acts in the Hebrew Bible. Joseph says something quite interesting. He says to his brothers, you intended evil by your actions, but God intended good for it. So this is a interesting sort of paradigm to look at events through in the Hebrew Bible. Uh, Joseph is very well respected in Egypt, and and Jacob and all of the rest of the family moved to Egypt to live with Joseph, and this is essentially where Genesis ends. Um, Genesis ends with Jacob and his family. This is Israel essentially. Um, all of the brothers, their family, and Jacob, and everyone living in Egypt, and there they that's where Genesis ends. The next book of the Hebrew Bible, Exodus, it picks up where this generation of Joseph and his children and their father Jacob, they have all passed away, and the Israelites are still a people. They are living in Egypt, but the Pharaoh who respected Joseph and was nice to him, that Pharaoh is no longer in power. There's another Pharaoh, and that Pharaoh does not treat the Israelites with the same type of respect. In fact, they become sort of slaves and servants to this new Pharaoh. And the Exodus sort of picks up in a very different situation, and the character that soon becomes the focus of Exodus is Moses. And this we'll talk about in the next lecture in Exodus, and the next point in the timeline, which reads the traditional date of the Exodus from Egypt, which they date at 1312 BCE. So from Abraham's birth to the Exodus from Egypt, according to the narrative timeline, is about 500 years. And so we'll pick up in the beginnings of Exodus in the next lecture. Hopefully, this helps a bit to fill in the first narrative information leading up to the birth of Abraham, and then hopefully, when we get to the next lecture on Exodus, we can fill in the gaps there. The next uh, notable event in the timeline that the book provides is approximate dates of biblical Israelite kingdom. So this is referring to basically the time of Saul, the time of David, and the time of Solomon shortly thereafter. So we'll cover a lot of ground in the next two lectures. Hopefully this is helpful. If you have any questions, I'm going to post this in a Canvas discussion board. And so if you have any questions on this video, just write that in the discussion and I'll be sure to answer the questions. Either questions on the Abrahamic religions, the structure of the Hebrew Bible, or the contents of the book of Genesis. Again, the book of Genesis has many more stories and much more detail than I was able to go into in this outline form. But if you have particular questions about particular passages in the scripture, I'll be happy to answer them there. Thanks again, everyone. Hope you're all well and healthy, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.